Wow, that's a small world. Sometimes I get
empowerment, workplace literacy, microlending, and sustainable development. She has published academic research in Oxford University Press and Stanford University Press. Her writings on diasporic Sikhs have been featured in Sikh Chic and Punjabi Beat magazine. In addition to teaching and research, Sangeeta is an active volunteer. She has been advisor to the Core Foundation since 2010. Currently, Dr. Luthra is teaching at Santa Clara University as an adjunct faculty in the anthropology department, and she lives in Los Angeles. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you to the organizers and to my fellow speakers. I'm very excited and inspired to maybe go back and do more work. I'm actually not a Sikh studies scholar. I'm an anthropologist, so everything I say here will come from that lens to some extent. So my topic today is promoting a culture of peace and harmony within the city Guru Granth Sahib. And instead of and I think that there's so much synergy with what Rahuldeep was talking about, and so maybe we can follow up on that in the discussion and with really all the speakers before me. Before I start, I wanted to share 3 autobiographical moments with you that really reflect my own personal journey towards understanding what it means to have or promote a culture of peace. So the first moment was actually here in San Jose about 7 years ago. I attended a function community function to celebrate Vaisakhi. And at the function, one of the keynote speakers spoke about the image of Guru Gobind Singh Ji. And he said, you know, in the minds of most Sikhs, when we think of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, we think of him, the valiant warrior, on a steed and ready to defend Sikhi. The speaker asked us to go beyond this image, and he said, you know, at the last days of Guru Gobind Singh Ji's life, he was really more of a statesman. And then the speaker spoke about the role of the last really kind of major act that Guru Gobind Singh Ji engaged in, which was to write the Zafarnama. And in the Zafarnama, what do we learn from the Zafarnama? What do we learn from the impulse of putting down the sword and picking up the pen? So that was really a profound moment for me. I mean, I've been raised as a Sikh, but I never thought of it that way. So I wanted us to just think about what Guru Gobind Singh Ji was struggling with as he wrote this wonderful body of poetry and this letter to his enemy, so-called Aurangzeb. So I'm just going to read a few stanzas so that we can think about the tension in this letter between the need to defend oneself and one's followers and the need to stop fighting and find a way to reconcile or create peace. So some of the stanzas that I picked out, and I apologize, these are in English translation, but that's what I was most comfortable with. So the first 2 stanzas really reflect that the justification for when to use force. And here Guru Gobind Singh Ji says to Aurangzeb, he says, I had perforce to join battle with thy hosts, and I too fought with muskets and arrows as best I could. But when an affair is past every other remedy, it is righteous indeed to unsheathe the sword. And I think most of us are familiar with this famous statement, right? When is it okay for me to defend myself? As you move down the letter, you now come to this in a very different tone within the Zafarnama, where Guru Gobind Singh Ji then talks about the need to reopen dialogue, to create a bridge with this person with whom, this community with whom he's in battle. He says, come to me, that we may converse with each other, and I may utter some kind words to thee. He goes on to say, it is incumbent upon you to recognize the God, for he told you not to create strife in the world. Shed not recklessly the blood of another with thy sword, lest the sword on high falls upon thy neck. He it is who creates all, from the feeble ant to the powerful elephant, and it is the embellisher of the meek and the destroyer of the reckless. In these last stanzas, what you see is Guruji moving towards a justification to opening a dialogue, and that to opening a dialogue with someone who seemed to be wanting to destroy him. In this, I see in Guru Gobind Singh Ji's choice and the last moments of his life really a model for Sikhs and for all humans in the world today. A world full of strife, a world full of war. We've been hearing about Syria and the civil war. So that's why I bring you that. The second autobiographical moment is really set at a time when I was doing my research in India, in New Delhi. And I'm going to follow the words of Dr. I.J. Singh, who encouraged all of us to ruffle some feathers. So I apologize if I ruffle feathers, but this is part of my personal journey. So when I was in India, I was doing research in New Delhi, and as the my little bio says, I did research on women's organizations. I worked on non-governmental organizations that worked with women and communities in poverty, and I was interested in literacy, and I spent a lot of time hanging out in what we would call slums in Delhi, and I was staying with my husband's Tayaji and Taiji, and they would worry, "Kithe jandi hai, kyun jandi hai?" But I always made it back, so everyone was okay. So one day I ended up in a community where I soon learned was full of Punjabi Hindus. And honestly, I was very shocked because most of the communities, especially in these big cities, are really populated by people from poorer states in Punjab. This was in 1995. And as I got to know the people in this community, what I learned was that many of them had left Punjab during the 1980s. And they left really out of a sense of fear. And I was, again, very surprised because I was not expecting to find Punjabis living in these circumstances. It wasn't something that I had assumed. And they described to me really, and as I got to know them, they described why they left, and they talked about the fact that, as Hindus, the women talked to me a lot more than the men, and they talked about not feeling comfortable wearing saris, not feeling, not being ridiculed for wearing saris and bindis, and just anyone who they felt, anyone who was a Hindu at that time, in this very time of great turmoil in Punjab, was kind of ridiculed and sometimes targeted. And so many of them picked up their homes, their businesses, they left what had been their ancestral homes and moved to Delhi. Needless to say, I was shocked. I had no clue that this was happening. And I was also really disheartened. And I was disheartened at the fact that these people left Punjab, the state in which the gurus had lived and traveled and built these wonderful institutions, in a sense of fear. And there was a kind of irony to me that they had migrated out of Punjab in the same way that Sikhs had migrated out, not the same, but in a similar way that Sikhs had migrated out of Pakistan during the partition. So that was, again, a kind of light bulb moment for me. And what it made me really start to think about was what was happening to the Sikh community. And was the movement in Punjab that led to lots of death and destruction on all sides, what was the end result of this movement? And then I started asking myself more kind of philosophical questions, is it okay to be a Sikh and display these types of intolerance? Is it okay to be a Sikh? When is violence okay and when is it not okay? And what are we doing as a community to kind of reestablish the line that Guru Gobind Singh Ji established in the Zafarnama between self-defense and violence for the sake of violence? And again, I'm not trying to offend anybody here, I'm just bringing this up because I wanted to think about what is it called, how do we promote a culture of peace within the Guru Granth Sahib, within our community. The third story has to do around the same time. So I was visiting, again, my husband's Tayaji and Taiji in Chandigarh, and in their living room they had this beautiful painting. And I was so thrilled when I saw this picture. I had never seen an image of Guru Nanak Dev Ji like this before. Again, I'm naive. I grew up in the United States, so maybe this was commonplace. But for me, this was, again, a kind of existential moment. And what I saw in this picture was Guru Nanak Dev Ji as an explorer, a student, and a bhagat, of the world. Someone seeking out different peoples and engaging them in dialogue about the world, about the divine. And it was just a beautiful image. I have this now. I luckily got a copy of it, and it's really something that is close to my heart. I got three things from this image as I thought about it, as it seeped into me. The first was the concept of a desire to learn about other people, not just about oneself. And as an anthropologist, this is very exciting to me. I mean, this was Guru Nanak Dev Ji being multicultural, and it thrilled me. The second was his use of dialogue and debate in engaging other traditions. And again, this was something that over time I'd learned about, but the picture is what got me to start thinking about it and learning about it. And the third was the focus on the need to promote justice, harmony, and respect for all human beings. And this is what this image really taught me, or made me start to think about. So having said that, I'll now start talking about what I think is the foundation for a culture of peace within our community today. And I think that foundation started with Guru Nanak Dev Ji, but really was built by the Gurus through a process, a very interesting process of including the Bani of the Bhagats into the Adi Granth. And here I am going to rely very heavily on the work of Dr. Prashara Singh, because as I revealed to all of you, I'm not a sixth degree scholar. But I think his work is very interesting because he talks about a set of methods, a methodology that was useful to the Gurus, but that is going to be equally useful to us in the world today, in dealing with all the problems we face today. So what did the Gurus do as they thought about how to incorporate the Bani of the Bhagats, Muslims, Sikhs, low castes, high caste, these people of all these different communities into the Guru Granth Sahib, and by doing so, really kind of canonize them, that is, give them the status almost equal to the Gurus. And what Prashara Singh tells us is that these three quotes, and I'll read them out to you, you can follow along here. This is just a summary of this process through which the Bhagat Bani was incorporated into the Adi Granth. So Prashara Singh Ji tells us, the process of selection of the Bhagat Bani highlights both exclusive and inclusive aspects of Guru Arjan's editorial policy. In other words, the selection logic favors those poems of the Bhagats that stress nirguna religiosity and social equality and are in general conformity with the Sikh Guru's line of thinking. And then he goes on, and I love the idea that they were both exclusive and inclusive. His point is that the Gurus didn't just take all of the Bhagat Bani, they made sure that that Bhagat Bani was in line with their own values. And that wasn't too much of a bridge to cross, but sometimes there were differences. And I'll talk about one of the very important differences in a minute. He also says that thus the Gurus were deeply concerned with cultivating a particular Sikh view of true teaching, practice, and community by way of editing and commentary on the received tradition of the Bhagat Bani. And here, all I want you to remember is this notion of editing and commentary. Because what I really like about this description is that the Gurus are very actively engaged in constructing, in crafting a message about what it means to be a Sikh. And they use it through this wonderful system of editing the work and commenting on the work. Finally, Prashara Singh concludes that the presence of the Bhagat Bani in the Sikh scripture provides an excellent example of the Catholicity or universality that promotes mutual respect and tolerance for diversity of belief and practice. So, and this has already been explored beautifully by, Nikki Maninder Kaur Kanji and all the other speakers, the notion of plurality. And but I really wanted to kind of focus on not just the Bani itself, but the process by which the Bani was compiled and constructed. So, you know, Guru, what I basically suggest is there's a methodology here. And there is what in anthropology we call a praxis of peace. And that's just a fancy way of saying living peace, living it through your day-to-day lives, through peaceful speaking, peaceful action. So what I got out of this, and what Dr. Prashara Singh suggests, is that the Gurus engaged in a praxis of pluralism by engaging the text of the Bhagats, these people who were not Sikhs themselves, and were not even necessarily part of the Panth, through editing and commentary. He describes, Dr. Prashara Singh describes this process as what he calls intertextuality, which is a fancy way of saying that you take the best practices of different people and bring them together, and you create something even better. So you take old and merge new, and you create something even better. So to me, what is interesting about intertextuality is that it's very similar to a core value that I want to focus on, which is reconciliation. How do we reconcile? The way Guru Gobind Singh Ji reconciled with Aurangzeb, tried to reconcile with Aurangzeb through the Zafarnama. So for me, reconciliation, that's a pillar of a culture of peace. So I'm just going to summarize here really quickly. What the Gurus were really doing is really trying to advocate for a few core values. One of them being the equality of all human beings, or egalitarianism, and these other core values that have to do with the doctrine of the word, or Shabad, spiritual discipline of Nam-Simran, doctrine of God is immanent, and the company of the saintly, that is being in the satsanga. These are kind of the key values that the Gurus were trying to preserve, even as they added the Bani of others into the Guru Granth Sahib. There's a very interesting example, though, here of how the Gurus went one step beyond what the Bhagats were doing. And in the respect for women, this is where the Gurus really took it to a different level. Because there's been research done that, you know, Kabir had produced a lot of Bani. Some of that Bani never made it into the Guru Granth Sahib. And one of the reasons why some of Kabir Bani did not make it into the Guru Granth Sahib was specifically because it really portrayed women in a derogatory way. It portrayed women as almost in what we call a misogynistic way. In other words, it saw women as somehow a distraction or from the ability of an individual to reach the divine. And the Gurus rejected this completely, and in this way they did it because they really truly were egalitarianists. They really truly believed in the equality of all humans. Go Gurus. Yay. So I can't say more than that. And here I'm just including a picture of Arpana Kaur, and the only reason I bring this because it's beautiful, but also because Arpana Kaur has just done a great job as an artist, illustrating some of these really core ideas that the Gurus have that the Gurus have of course done in their Bani, which is also beautiful poetry and creativity. So I'm just going to say one more word, which is that I wanted to, the other thing that I wanted to highlight from Dr. Prashara Singh's work is that he defines the word Bhagat, and he says that the word Bhagat comes from the Bhakti tradition, and it comes from the Sanskrit root of Bhaj, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, which means to share. And, you know, as I was listening to the earlier speakers, I was thinking that, you know, sharing is, in fact, an act of peace. Because when we share, we don't just give, we also receive. And in order to receive, we have to be open. Our minds have to be open, our hearts have to be open. And, you know, the speaker, Janelle Singh Ji, who spoke before we took the break for lunch, this was something that I felt I got from his speech, even with my limited Punjabi, was that, you know, how can we cleanse our minds and our hearts? It is through that process of being open, of being a bhakt, of being open-hearted and sharing. So I think I'm going to leave it at that so that I don't go too much beyond it. Maybe I'll just summarize. The Guru's method, in my view, involves 3 steps: egalitarianism, dialogue, and reconciliation, and each enables the next. And I do believe that there is a path for us as Sikhs to reinvigorate a culture of peace. We're not inventing it. Our gurus lived it. We are just bringing it back and bringing it to the forefront of our communities, and in particular for our children. I think this is very important. I think our children actually know more than us because they deal with anti-bullying things in school. They think about peaceful interaction much more than we do. And I agree with Rahuldeep, let's let them lead once in a while, although not at home. But and I guess I'll finally say that as an anthropologist, you know, I talk a lot about conflict in the world, and it's depressing and really sad stuff, and my students are always like, you know, please do something interesting and fun. But I do believe that we as Sikhs, as Rahuldeep was saying, we're small people, but we're sawa lakh, and so we have the ability, through a culture of peace, to really, really defeat our enemies. Rather, pick up the pen, put down the sword for now, and I think this can happen. So I'll finish with Nanak Naam Chardi Kala Tere Thank you. How can we take your experiences and educate young women in Sikhi? I don't know how to answer that. I think that, you know, the way I learned about Sikhi actually is because I spent a lot of time in India. And I spent a lot of time in India because my parents were either really naive or really confident in my ability to not get into trouble. But I think that we as parents need to do that, especially with our daughters. I think that we want to protect our daughters, but we also want to teach them to not be afraid of the world, to get out there, because if we keep them too close to us, they won't be able to bring the gifts that they have to give to the world, and they won't be ready to face the world. And you know, one of the things that I was going to talk about here that is really close to my heart also is, you know, the problems that we see in India with, you know, the ratio of girls to boys. And I think that, and all the problems that we've been reading about in the newspapers, but I think that, you know, I really believe this, but I think that one way to really help our daughters become better Sikhs is to break down the kind of segregation that we tend to reproduce in our communities. You know, and I mean gender segregation, and here's another radical thing, and Ajay Uncle, I'm going to blame this on you, but maybe we should reconsider how we sit in gurdwaras. And I think that sometimes those things are useful, but sometimes that level of segregation can lead to a kind of unknown. And I think that, you know, we really want to promote better communication between our daughters and our sons, and so I guess that's the way. Give your daughters some room to be independent, to get out there in the world. And I know it's scary, but and I hope I can follow my own advice. So yeah, Anita.
That was really inspiring to hear, and I feel like while it was a process for the gurus for the compilation of the Guru Granth Sahib, it's also a process for us as a community while in creating dialogue and making sure we share the space and making sure we stand shoulder to shoulder with one another and not belittle or put on pedestal, but we're all there in a shared and equal space, and really do draw a line or have the courage to respectfully draw a line when there's rhetoric that's being expressed that isn't in line with Sikh belief, and really maybe just peacefully asking or questioning that and saying, well, why do you think that, or why is this coming up for you? And I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion just in response to the question about educating women. I would like to point out there's a project, it's called the Sikh Love Stories Project, and we're doing a collection of stories from Sikh women across the country, and then we're also doing it for Sikh men. So if any men are interested in writing for this collection, we'd love to hear from you. And Sangeeta is an editorial board member, and so is Jessie Kaur. She's an editorial board member. And I do feel that there will be rippling education that comes from that collection, because one, it will allow young Sikh women, or multi-generational Sikh women, to have a space and a voice to express themselves, and the discussions that can bubble up will essentially pull everyone else into that discussion. So I really, it's just a really exciting project, and I do think that is a tool for education, and we'll have the same going for the men as well.
Thank you, Meeta. And in fact, that's a better answer than I gave, which is teach your daughters how to express themselves clearly, not be afraid to express themselves in a respectful, but respect themselves also. And really, self-expression is the key for our daughters, for all of us. It's not just for our daughters, but as my father always said, when my daughter's happy, I'm happy too. So. Someone asked me, you talked about how Guru Arjan Dev Ji edited and left out derogatory literature regarding women. Why were no women bhagats included in the Guru Granth Sahib? So based on my reading, I'll ask Rahul to help me answer this, but based on what I've read in Dr. Prashar Singh's book, and maybe Nikki Gurinder Kaur can answer this also, that there was one woman, Bhagat Mirabai, who was considered, but she came from a tradition, bhakti tradition, that was called Saguna Bhakti, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, she was really focused on Lord Krishna, and the Gurujis were really promoting a vision, as we know, as so many people have already emphasized, Nirguna Bhakti. And so they felt that this was incompatible. But I don't know if there are other reasons. So if either of you have an explanation for why no women were included, please come and help me.
Maybe I can add a word. I think during that period of history, women were performing even more important function of giving birth to the Bhagats.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. And there is a very important manuscript in which Mirabai one is included, and then some second thoughts about it, probably for theological reasons, not for gender reasons.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.